The Benko Gambit sacrifices a pawn for piece activity.
Paul Morphy always chose the open positions versus closed ones because he was looking for tactics. If he had an opportunity to trade pawns, he would.
Tactics always beat positional chess. That's why Kasparov won against Karpov in most of the World Championship matches.
In 1984, Anatoly Karpov was the reigning world chess champion. The challenger was Garry Kasparov. The match lasted 5 months, from September of 1984 to February of 1985, and was 48 games long with 40 draws. After 9 games, Karpov was up 4 wins. He needed 6 wins to win the match.
By the 48th game, FIDE canceled the match because both players were exhausted, and Karpov had lost 22 pounds. And the final score between the two players after 40 draws was 5-3. Later that year in 1985, Kasparov had a rematch against Karpov. This match had different rules and was the best of 24 games. And if the match ended 12-12 after 24 games, then Karpov would retain the title. After 15 games, the score was tied. The 16th game is the game I'd like to share because it had 41 moves. You don't see a game this short generally at top-level chess, and you don't see one side win against the other and make it look so simple. Kasparov sacrifices a pawn and gains piece activity in the beginning of the game. Karpov is playing white and Kasparov is playing black, and the game starts e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6. The timing variation of the Sicilian defense. So here Karpov played knight to b5, and in the 14th game of the match, he actually played the move knight to c3 and g4. And here, Kasparov played a pawn sacrifice. So this was actually the second time in the match that Kasparov had played the gambit d5. Earlier in the 1984 World Championship match, Kasparov did have this position against Karpov, and he played the move bishop to e7. And b6 here. So, as far as the move d5 is concerned, this was the second time that Kasparov was playing this gambit. And now, after knight to b4, the pawn is threatened 3 times and only defended twice. So, in the first time that Kasparov played this gambit, Karpov responded with bishop to c4. And so now we'll go through a few moves of that game and also some of the ideas behind that line. So some more about the history of this gambit. It was first played in the 1965 Hungarian Championship in the game Hanfi Delhi, and Kasparov was not aware of this game when this pawn was sacrificed, but instead he found the move d5 during a flight from Baku to Moscow in the spring of 1985 on his pocket chess set. So the idea is that the knight on a3 is out of play, and black wants to gain activity through sacrificing a pawn and take advantage of this knight, which is misplaced. The move bishop e2 is played by Karpov pretty instantaneously, and he wanted to avoid bishop c4, which he had played in the last game. In the 1965 game, Hanfi played queen a4 check, and queen b3. But this move is not nearly as good because it's a waste of time. After bishop c4, one of the better responses is bishop to g4. And now here white can either play bishop e2 or move their queen to a few different squares. And the engine thinks this is about equal. Another square the queen can move after bishop g4 is queen to d2. And b5. And this is not bad for black. Another square the queen can move is d4. And again, Kasparov was playing b5 here. So after bishop g4 and bishop to e2, which was played by Karpov in the first game, and this was game 12 of the World Chess Championship match. The game continued. Bishop takes e2, bishop e3. After 4 more moves, a draw was agreed. There's a lot to consider after the move bishop to e2. Kasparov had analyzed these lines many times with his trainers, so Karpov was not as in familiar territory with these lines. One option was to play knight b takes d5 immediately and win the pawn back. And bishop g4. Another idea here. And bishop f3. This is about equal. And bishop e2. So this is not much to want to play. And white is up about 0.8 pawns here, according to the engine. So another alternative after bishop e2 was to take the pawn with the knight on f6. And white likely castles here, but another alternative would be knight takes d5. And this is equal. And here bishop e6, but also possibly bishop e7. And the active knight on b4 pretty much leads to an equal game here. More challenging in this position is queen a4 check. This line is not as good. And this was also an option, but b5 is probably better. And white can try sacrificing a knight here. And rook d1. So white has 2 pawns for the piece in an attack. And this is a game, Almasi versus Horvath from the Hungarian Championship of 1993. And this is not necessarily winning yet, but black played bishop e7. And one possibility is bishop c4, although bishop c6 was played. And queen a8. The engine says this is about minus 0.9. So better was bishop to c6. Questionable but possibly good is g4 here. And black is up 1.7 pawns. And here you have a situation where the knight is being attacked by 3 pieces and defended by 3 pieces. b4 attacks the rook and prevents black from defending the knight. If knight takes b4, then rook takes d6. And if queen takes b4, then bishop takes d5. So queen takes c6 is the best move. And queen b5. And white is up about 0.5 pawns here. So Kasparov was aware of all this and decided instead of capturing back on d5 to play an interesting idea that wasn't the best move, but worked very well in the game, and that was bishop to c5. So Kasparov writes, this move, which we thought was very good, was also made quickly and firmly, after which Karpov became anxious, and realizing that he had again not guessed the direction of our thorough home analysis, and that he would have to carry out the main work at the board against a well-prepared opponent. I'm reading from Kasparov's books on his own games, This is part of his collection with Everyman Chess, where he published first 5 books from my great predecessors with analysis of the games of all the previous world champions. And then he wrote 4 books of modern chess, which is games from the 1970s to 2009. And then the third series that he wrote was 3 books of his own analysis of his own games. There's lots of variations, and the analysis is very good. It's interesting to see his thought process, especially because he's narrating his events as being the top player in the world. So bishop c5 was not the best move in this position, but it was a dynamic move and it was good. And especially before the age of computers, it was useful to play this move because it's very difficult to refute. So you'll see at different points throughout the game that Karpov actually had different moves that he could have made to have found a way out of the lack of development that later occurs. It's much more difficult to find these moves over the board than it is later on, especially with engines these days. And now Karpov castles. So here's an example of where white could have played a move that would have been better than the move in the game, and that was bishop e3. Now bishop takes, check, and the knight is hit. So this is one line that Kasparov found after the game that would have been better for white. So here he can play either knight d7 or bishop to d7. In this position, white has an advantage. And this was actually a game that Karpov played a year later. So also after queen a4 check, possible was bishop d7. And either bishop f3 or castles is good here. And at best, black is playing for a draw here. So bishop c5 is not the best move. So here black castles. And bishop f3 was played. Also possible was bishop g5. After bishop e6, this should be a draw. The 2 bishops are an advantage, but double pawns are a disadvantage. So, interestingly enough, after bishop f3, Karpov is retaining the material. Instinctively, Karpov is playing for a win here because he's up a pawn, but Kasparov was prepared in his home analysis. Black's first achievement. It is now not easy for the knight on a3 to come into play. In addition, the d3 square is weakened. If instead h6, bishop e3 and the knight escapes. C2 has two pieces attacking the square, and it's only defended once by the queen. Bishop G5. Here, if they would have tried knight C4, then this would have run into a tactic with bishop C2, and bishop D3 picks up the knight. Also possible after bishop to E3. And this pawn is weak. Or even queen B6 immediately. If queen D2, then again bishop D3. This is about equal, but somewhat unclear. It doesn't look like black has that much advantage here because they only have a slight lead in development, but Kasparov was able to improve his position even more. In the game, he played rook e8. Another option here is b5. But this doesn't control the e4 square. So bishop e4, even d6 is good. Or even h6. And bishop e4. So the point of rook e8 was to prevent a move like this. And now queen d2 is played in the game. So he could have returned the pawn with knight c4. And here bishop takes c4. If bishop takes f1, then this wins two pieces for the rook. It's not worth it here for white to give up the exchange. Also possible is rook e1. And this position is slightly more active for black. b5 exclamation point was played in the game. So this prevents the knight from returning to the game from the c4 square. And rook ad1 was played. Also possible was d6. This is about equal. Or even queen f4. This is minus 0.7. So rook a d1 is not a bad move. Knight d3, exclamation point. This move is very active and it prevents a lot of development. Immediately it's threatening pawn to b4, winning a knight. It's also guarding the c1 and e1 squares, which prevents rook development. And it's just a good outpost for the knight. It's guarded by the bishop on f5. This move actually Kasparov had found on his pocket chess set, so this was part of his home analysis. Another important feature about outposts that are on the 3rd and 6th rank is that if they're on a square where they cannot be attacked by pawns, that's another advantage of those ranks. So in this case, the c and e pawns have already moved. So in this position, Karpov played the knight on the a file to b1, and this was actually a bad move, but it's difficult to find the best moves here because there's a lot of constraints on the position, and so actually we can look at a few other resources, and obviously in retrospect the game is a lot easier to analyze than when you're playing it in real time. So here in this position we can look at the moves bishop e2 and d6. So the idea of bishop e2 is to move the knight. This is actually even worse than knight b1 because of the following line. So notice that b4 is still threatened. Since there's the winning of a knight already and this knight's attacked, then it's possible to play knight takes f2. And then we have b4 here. And the engine likes bishop takes b1. And knight e4 check, attacking the queen and the bishop. And here the engine likes queen a5. So now the problem with defending this bishop here is that there's a discovered attack along the e file against the e2 bishop, so there's not really a way to save the piece. And white can try either queen f4, and black is up 5 points, or queen d4, and then knight takes g5. So bishop e2 is losing, but better is d6, which was not played in the game. And now here there's a number of responses. So the first line that we can look at is b4. And now this move is an attempt to dislodge the d3 knight. If bishop takes d7, then queen takes d3. Also possible in this position, instead of a takes b3, was bishop a7. In this position, white's up 2 points. And queen a5 takes the knight. And this position is roughly equal, which is better than what happened in the game. So another response to the move d6 is rook a7. So now we have bishop to e2. And again, we have the resource knight takes f2, but also possible was knight e5. But this is not very good after knight to d5. White is up 2 points here. So knight takes f2. Now queen f4 hits the bishop. And the rook on a7 is attacked. So rook to d7. And knight c4. Black can try bishop to c2. But now knight to b6. So this hits the bishop and the rook. Another threat is bishop to g4. So f5 is played here. So either of these moves are winning. Knight takes a4 or knight takes d7 and takes the pawn. So after f5, white is up 3 points. Another try after pawn to d6 is rook to b8. Here, Karpov can either try bishop to e2, which leads again to knight takes f2, or knight to d5. And now Kasparov can try either queen takes d6 or bishop takes d6. This attacks the f6 pawn. And b4. And it's unclear. It says minus 0.6. So also after bishop takes d6, and knight c2, this is plus 0.7. Kasparov said that he actually was going to try the move queen takes d6 if d6 was played in the game, which is an exchange sacrifice. So now there's a few lines here. We have bishop takes a8. And here white can try either bishop takes f6, h3, or knight to e2. Knight to e2 is the worst move because of knight g4. And queen e5. The point of this move is to remove the pin along the d file so the knight is able to move. And now the f2 square is threatened. So let's say knight to b1. And this is winning for black. That's why h3 looked better in this position, but also even better than that was bishop takes f6. Possible was b4, but knight takes b4. So here either queen d5 or knight to d5. And it's about even. And after queen f3, there is compensation for the exchange sacrifice, and it's about equal here. d6 is a difficult move to come up with because intuitively you want to deal with this potential double attack, and it's difficult to think about activating the bishop when you're behind in development, because this also does in some ways give up a pawn. What happened in the game was worse, and it led to a lot of inactivity. Karpov is not able to play bishop e2 because he runs out of time, and in this position Kasparov played h6. So bishop h4 is played, but also possible where bishop e3 and bishop takes f6. This move leads to a weakness. Also possibly good is rook takes e3 and queen b6. And they have to play rook takes f2 or else knight takes d1 is with check. And this is winning. And this is also bad. So bishop h4 is played. And now this move attacks the knight on c3, and knight a4 is played. After knight a4, both knights are actually on the flank of the board. Also possible was knight to e2. One option here is knight e5. Although this is unclear. Better is g5. And now bishop takes g5. If pawn takes, then queen takes check. The bishop's hit, bishop g6, and rook takes d3. So instead of pawn takes, knight takes f2. If bishop takes f6, then knight e4 check. So rook takes f2. And now here either knight takes d5 or queen b6 are good. Queen to b6. And Kasparov's winning in this position. This is -2. So even better was knight takes d5, and now queen takes d8 is better than queen takes d5. So if this move is played, then here's a sample line. And now king h1 is better if king to f1 This is checkmate. So this would be winning for black. So that's why queen takes d8, and black's doing fine. So that's why after g5, bishop g3. No, the bishop is trapped, so knight c1. And here knight takes b2. If knight takes c1, then this doesn't work because now the bishop's hit. So even this possibly offered better chances to defend than what happened in the game. Although this does not look very good for Karpov. So here bishop d6 was played. Bishop a7 is also not bad. And again, this was actually still part of Kasparov's home analysis. So black is more active in this position. 3 out of 4 of white's minor pieces are on the edge of the board. And the d3 knight is very strong. One commentator described the knight on d3 as an octopus. So it's still up to Kasparov to prove that this is winning position. And bishop g3 is played. There were 2 other options instead of bishop g3. Notice that the bishop on h4 is hanging, so there were problems with tactics if the bishop is left on that square. So, for example, let's say b3 was played with the idea of knight to b2, then bishop takes h2. This produces a discovered attack against the bishop. At first it doesn't look that effective, but this is actually decisive. And now knight to f4. So immediately this just threatens bishop takes and queen takes and mate. So pretty much white has to play queen takes f4 here. For example, let's say king to g1. Now this threatens queen g4 and queen g2. So this allows queen g3. So rook e5. And there's no defense. Let's say f4, then queen g4 is winning. b3 immediately is not good. Another option that Kasparov was looking at was queen c2. And then he was thinking of the following line. Immediately this threatens the move bishop to c2, which wins the rook. And g5. This is an effective idea throughout the game with g5 to g4, and this bishop often has problems. g4 here. And now e2 is covered by the knight and the rook, so that's not possible to play bishop e2. And also if bishop to d1, then the knight on b1 is hanging. So let's try bishop takes f4. Now there's few responses. Again, bishop to d1 leads to bishop takes b1. If bishop e2, then the rook is hanging. So another try is rook to d4. Because now if pawn takes f3, then rook takes f4. So bishop to e5. The rook is hit and the bishop is hit. Bishop to e2, then bishop takes d4. Bishop takes g4 is played. And now if bishop takes d4, then bishop takes f5. So knight takes g4. And this is a pretty effective attack on both of these points. So rook takes g4. Let's say this is played. And there's nothing that white can do about bishop g1. So there's a lot of tactics in these lines, which makes it more difficult to defend. On some level, you have to use as much analysis as you can, but on another level, you have to use intuition as well. So bishop g3 was played. Kasparov played the move rook to c8. The other move that he was looking at was knight to e4. He also looked at the move bishop takes g3. Both of these moves produce less than a pawn of an advantage for black, but he decided to play rook c8 because it was the better among the three. After knight e4, if queen takes d3, then knight takes g3, and this is winning. Because the rook hangs, it's -3. So bishop takes e4. Bishop takes, and then Kasparov saw the move queen e3, which is relatively freeing, so he didn't like this. And this is -0.7. He also looked at the move bishop takes g3. And now h takes g3. And now there's two responses here, either queen d6 or queen a5. If queen d6, then bishop to e2 and knight to e5. And this position is -0.8. I wanted to clarify on the way I'm describing the game. If I say plus and a quantity, that means that white is better. If I say minus and a number, that means that black is better. Anything less than 1 point or a pawn is an advantage. Anything more than a pawn is better or winning. So also queen a5. Now the pawn cannot capture on a3 because the pawn is pinned to the queen. This attacks a5. And this prepares to trade off the knight on d3. This position is unclear, but also roughly equal. If f takes g3, queen d7, b3, queen a7 check, king h1, and queen d4, and he looked at this and said this was better for him in his position. And the engine likes this too a lot. And right now it says 2-pawn advantage, so it didn't really look that much better to me, so I analyzed it for a few more moves. But this is actually really active, and it translates into a material advantage much later on if you keep analyzing it. Now queen a8. So this looks like it leaves the bishop hanging, but if rook takes f5, then knight takes b2, and this rook will be captured. So rook g1, and I'll just show a few more moves. And queen e4, and just assume that this position is going to lead to an advantage in the endgame, because the pieces will make their way to the second rank, and this pawn would likely be captured. He looked at both moves, bishop takes g3 and knight e4, and he decided that rook c8 was the better among the three. Now b3 is played by Karpov, and the idea is knight to b2 to trade off the knight on d3. One way to prevent this is bishop to e5. Because now the b2 square is controlled, but Kasparov liked to move g5 even better, which is what he played. Now knight to b2 is not possible, because after knight takes b2, the bishop is lost after rook to c2. Bishop takes d6 was played, but also bishop e2, then knight to e4. If queen takes d3, then knight takes g3 hits the rook, the bishop, and the queen. And the queen's trapped. Bishop takes d6 is played the game. Also worth looking at instead of bishop takes d6 is h4. Interesting was the move knight to f4, but he liked knight e4 even better. And this leads to an attack. So if f3, then bishop h7 is good. And bishop f4. Now the rook is hit, so if rook to d1, then this produces checkmate. Also worth looking at is bishop takes d6. If h takes g5, then knight f4 is good. And this is winning. Now if knight to b2, this is also winning. Also worth looking at is h takes g5. Queen e3 is bad because, and this is -4. If instead of queen e3, g takes h6 is played, rook e6 is effective. After king h2, then queen b7, and the idea is knight to e5. Bishop takes d6 was played in the game. Queen takes d6. And now g3. Knight f4 is a possibility, and so I wanted to prevent that. If Karpov tried to drive the knight from the d3 square with bishop e2, then knight to f4, and Kasparov would have a good attack here. So after g3, one idea for why is to play knight to b2 and try to trade off this knight here. Kasparov plays knight to d7, although there were two other responses which also would have been a good way to maintain activity. One is bishop g6. This hits the bishop on f3 and knight e4. And this knight's going to go to c3, which is good position for black. Another option instead of bishop g6 was knight to e5 and bishop d3. So rook fe1 is the main move to look at, but also worth considering is knight to b2. The knight e4 is good. And bishop takes f1. And here there's no good moves except to give up the queen. So rook takes e5, but if queen e3, this is strong. And white is fighting for a draw here. So knight d7 was played. Karpov played bishop g2. Another possibility was now playing knight to b2. Kasparov said the knight 7 to e5 here was good, but it was not the best course, and even better than this move was queen to f6. For example, And bishop g2 here. If queen takes d3, then knight e5 with a double attack on f3. This also wins the queen because the white queen is trapped in the middle of the board. Wherever they go, they will be attacked after knight takes f3. Also bad is bishop g4 because of knight e5, exclam. If bishop takes c8, then knight to f3 check wins the queen. Instead of bishop g4 or queen takes d3, white can try bishop g2. Here white has a bishop and a pawn for the rook, and black has more activity. Also possible instead of knight takes d3 is knight to c4. And now rook takes c4, exclaim. And knight 7 to e5. Previously, Kasparov wrote that Karpov could have responded with bishop e2. This is a discovered attack against the queen, so the knight and f4 can't be taken. So bishop d3 is the main line, but if queen takes c4, then this leads to checkmate. And if king h1, queen f3 checkmate. And this is winning, so let's say that Karpov didn't play anything here. Just a waiting move like a3, then we have g4, queen f6, and queen h5 mate. So if bishop takes d3, then rook takes d3 as an attempt to weather the storm. But better is knight h3 check. And bishop g4 is winning. So let's say bishop takes c4, this wins. Another attempt to defend is queen sacrifice. One idea here is knight to b2. Knight takes f3. And the queen's trapped. So this doesn't look too good for Karpov. So knight b2 was not played in the game, and instead bishop g2 was played. Queen f6, exclamation point. This controls the b2 square twice and prevents knight b2. So if we look at white's position, really the rooks and the knights are not developed at all. The rooks are on files that they're not really being used. So there's a large difference in piece activity in this game. A takes b4, a takes b4. And now queen a2 was played. Another idea was h3, but then knight 7 e5. The engine says minus 2.5 here. Bishop g6, exclamation point. This prevents white's activity even more, like preventing a move such as f4. Also possible is knight t1, and I have a line here. And now the queen is trapped, so I have to play knight b2. And bishop takes b1, with an attack on f2. So the queen cannot capture on d7. Also, instead of bishop g6, rook e5 was possible. d6 was played in the game. So he's trying to develop his pieces. g4 was played, but let's look at queen takes d6. So after queen takes d6, I have an engine line here. Rook e2. And now knight takes f2. And rook c2. This hits the bishop. This threatens g4 and queen takes h2 is mating. And this is -4. This line is just a sample after queen takes d6, but there's a few other alternatives that you could have looked at after knight takes f2. Or bishop to h3 instead of pawn to d6. And knight f4 exclaim is good. This at least wins the queen or a knight. Or even here is good. If h3, knight e1 is winning. So a line that I have here is rook takes e1 and rook c2. Now queen takes c2 is better than knight b2, which gets checkmated. Also h5 here is good. If g takes h4, the knight to f4 is strong. This is winning. g4 exclam was played in the game. In this position, white is practically stalemated. Karpov used up in the next 6 moves all of his remaining time before the next time control. Queen d2 was played. And f3. The move f4 is not any better after queen d4 and bishop f5. Queen takes d6 was played, and f takes g4. Another possibility which did not improve the position much was knight to b2 here. And queen f2. If king h1, then bishop takes d3 is good. Rook e1, then knight takes f3. And if rook f2, then rook c2 is good. And rook e3 is winning. Let's say knight f4, then bishop e4. Instead of knight b2, f takes g4 was played. Kasparov played queen d4 check, king h1, and knight f6, threatening the pawn on g4. Rook f4 was played. If h3, knight e4 is winning. But Kasparov was also just planning rook e3 in this position. And let's say rook f4, then queen to e5. So after rook f4, the queen has to make a decision. So black played knight e4. This concentrates enough pieces on the f2 square to play knight f2 check and hits the queen, as well as blocks the rook attacking the queen on d4. So Karpov played queen takes d3, which there was not any alternative, really. Let's look at a sample line with queen a2. And also queen to e2. Another possibility besides queen takes d3 in this position is rook takes e4, and then here's a line, g5, and rook c2. Queen takes f2 is possible, but if they don't, then this is also winning. So queen takes d3 was losing along with the other moves. Rook takes f2 was played. And rook f to d2. And now queen e3 exclaim. This is the easiest way to win. And Kasparov played rook to c1. Karpov is very uncoordinated here. So if takes the queen, then this is winning. Queen f2, threatening rook e1. Also possible here was rook e2. Oh, 1. And Karpov resigned. This was a turning point in the match, and now Kasparov was leading 8.5 to 7.5. This game was judged to be the best in the 40th volume of Informator. Part of the reason why Karpov may have lost the game was because at some point he should have been playing for a draw. But he thought, and the mentality is, that if you're up a pawn, you should play for a win. Kasparov won because the knight on d3 was better than most pieces on the board. In the end, Karpov had to trade his queen for that knight. Another thing that I found surprising about this game was that black won because he trapped white's queen in the middle of the board in the middle game.